please do not ask developers to create 573 lines of YAML to deploy their application. You need to create some kind of abstraction that they can define what matters for their applications. And same thing for infrastructure.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 137, Shifting Infrastructure Management Left. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
As application developers, we keep hearing shift left, which is basically code speak for more stuff's going to be dumped on you.
I would like to qualify it as you will have more freedom. You will be in more control over what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a nice thought. You know that's not reality.
Depends really from organization to organization, case to case. But ultimately, I think that even though it might not look always like that, we all want to be independent in our work. As long as that independence does not mean too much overhead, right? Like, let me think of something that is unrelated with application development. Like, yes, writing books, right? I was actually much more productive and my job was easier when I got to the point that I can self-publish. Because I got to the point that self-publishing was almost no overhead, right?
You were able to choose that process. You were able to pick your editors, if you will, or you could choose to even not use an editor because you had the choice.
And publishing was actually, at the end of the day, maybe it was painful at the very beginning, but at the end of the day, it was less overhead on writing to self-publish than not to self-publish, which maybe sounds counterintuitive, right? And if I go back to applications, if it takes a second or almost no effort to build your application, isn't that easier for you than to request that somebody builds application for you? If requesting actually for somebody to build application takes more than you building it, wouldn't you want to build it yourself?
Let's take it one step further. Let's say I don't mind building the application, but I have to call somebody to get infrastructure.
Same thing. If we can get to the point that you getting infrastructure you need is the same amount of effort or less than you opening a ticket for somebody to create it and going through the steps of that ticket and back and forth. If doing it yourself takes the same or less amount of effort, wouldn't you want to do it? And a good example is, even though it sounds almost ridiculously different, if you think of local Kubernetes cluster as infrastructure of sorts for local development, isn't it easier for you to have Docker desktop or Rancher desktop or something like that than to have somebody to come to your laptop every time you need a cluster, local cluster, and start it for you? I know it's a ridiculous example, it's kind of oversimplified, but conceptually it's the same thing. There is no way that I would go back to asking an operator or sysadmin or whatever the role is in my company to give me a cluster in AWS if all I have to do is execute a single command and maybe wait a bit, but I will need to wait no matter whether I'm creating it or somebody else. So I think it's all about getting to the point where developers, anybody actually, can create and be in control of everything related to the life cycle of an application. And that control being almost effortless. And that raises the question, first of all, wouldn't you want that? And I would guess that the answer is yes. Why not? There is no obvious downside. And then we get to the point of what would be the role in such a situation of people on the right? What do they do? If they're not creating clusters for me anymore, or whatever else, what do they do? And the answer to that is almost self-evident, and that is making sure that developers' job is effortless in doing those things. Or to put it in other words, is to create services for developers. You need a cluster. Excellent. This is how you create a cluster. And this is the level of control when creating that cluster that you're comfortable with. What do you care about? Let's say, Darren, you're a developer. What do you want to create a cluster yourself? Whenever you need it, excellent. What do you care about? And then you would come and say, I care about this, and that. Kind of, I want to be able to choose where that cluster is. I'm inventing now. That will depend from person to person, team to team, organization to organization. Oh, I care. I just want to say I want a cluster in AWS, or I want a cluster in Google, and I really don't care about anything else. Excellent. Then you, as SRE, you know the interface of that service that you need to create. It should have a single parameter that says provider. Right? I'm simplifying it. It's more complicated than that. But from the process perspective, that's what it is. And then I'm coming to almost inevitable conclusion that actually you, Darren, as a representative of developers in this story, you're my user, just as other people are users of your application, the one that you're building. And you need to satisfy those users. If you're building a front end for a, online shopping site, you need to know what people need. You need to know what people want. You need to know what people are willing to pay for. And the same thing goes for SREs and people on the right side. Those developers are your users. Figure out what they need. You have the goal for them to be self-sufficient, for them not to need you directly, for them to need you as a service provider and not as a support department. We have the goals, we have the roles set, and then it's all about communication and doing the work. You're my user. You need a service that will do X, whatever X is, create a cluster, deploy the application, what's or not, what would make you happy? What are the things that you care about? The same way as if I go back to the shopping site, online shopping, your users care about browsing the products. Your users care about putting something in a shopping cart. Your users care about buying that something and that something being shipped to them. Do they care about what is the language that the shopping cart will be written in? No. So you don't expose that to them, right? You expose to your users only the things that they care about. And the challenging part is to figure out what that something is.
And this whole conversation is based on a question from Momodu. From your experience, what do I need to put in place to practice shift left infrastructural management in production? And it's everything that you just said. Unless you're manager over all those teams that Victor just basically laid out, there's near zero that you can do. Now, if you are completely in charge of everything yourself, then you do what Victor said, a service that people can consume. Now, the question is, if I'm shifting everything left towards the application developer, are they defining? And let's assume that we're going to do everything in a Git-defined way. I'm not going to say GitOps, but I'm going to say a Git-defined way. Would that infrastructure definition live with my application code in the same repository?
I think so. If we take a developer-centric approach and not operation-centric approach, then yes. Or I can answer that with a question. Would the build script of an application live in application repo or somewhere else? And assuming that you, dear developer, you're actually building that application yourself.
Oh, if I'm building it myself, then it would make sense for it to live in that application, in that repository.
Exactly. And if you as a developer, if you're defining pipelines, CI/CD pipelines, again, with the help of others. So others are creating some common libraries or common whatever that depends on the technology, how we call it, but there are kind of libraries that you invoke. You're not writing pipelines from scratch. You have helper functions, but you are, dear developer, defining ultimately the pipeline itself. Where are you going to put it? In the repo of the application. It's almost inevitable answer to that question if we identify developer as the persona creating the pipeline, and so on and so forth. And if we eventually get to manifests that define the application, and those manifests are actually processed by that service that we commented before, then yes, they should be in the repository of the application. With a note, an important note, right? I'm talking about the manifests of the application, not necessarily the manifests of a specific environment where that application is running. Those two things tend to be different. Usually the manifests of an environment, like this is how that specific application runs in production and it is part of a bigger system, which is production, then those would be different manifests that are based on your application manifests, right? So they in a way extend those manifests being stored in the application repository and add additional capabilities or additional properties or whatnot. But if you're talking about at least the base manifests, I have no doubt that must be in the repo of the application. If no other reason, then because the story starts at the local development. And by local development, it could be like Git pod local development. I mean, that's not really local, but still the same purpose, right? So it starts at local development. I write code, I build code, I deploy code, all locally, give or take. And I'm definitely not going to want to go to 3, 4, 5, 6 different repositories to do that operation, especially if I'm doing it with high frequency, kind of every few minutes or something like that. So it needs to be very accessible to me. And the easiest way to make it accessible is to have it in the same repo.
Going back to the question, he specifically stated in production. So you just called out, you would have your base manifest in with the application, which makes sense.
Yes.
But what would I do to get to that in production? What's one way that could be solved?
It's depends on technology we use, whether it's maybe Argo CD, maybe Flux, maybe something else. The format would be different, but it all boils down to the same idea, is that maybe analogy would be code of an application that uses libraries, right? Libraries are stored somewhere else. Libraries in this context of an application used by an application are equivalent to applications in the context of deployments, right? You have different places where you invoke those libraries, usually more than one. The same thing for manifest for, let's say, production. If it's, such a manifest would say, hey, this is where the base manifests are. This is where majority of the things are that are common to other non-production environments, right? So everything that is not specific to production is there and is used by me, production, but also by staging and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, so you're extending some base manifests, and on top of that, you're saying, okay, but in production, we are using Canary deployments, right? That's not used anywhere else because it doesn't make sense to have Canary deployments in, let's say, staging or local environment. So those production manifests are taking the base manifest plus adding additional things that are specific to production and overwriting other things that are also specific to production. A good example of something that you overwrite typically with a parameter would be the host. We're not going to have the same host locally in staging and production. It could be acme.com in production, but in staging is going to be staging.acme.com and locally is going to be localhost. So you extend base manifests, you add additional manifests that are specific to that environment and not used anywhere else, and you use parameters to overwrite specific bits that are going to production, like host.
And you're proposing here that would be an environmental repository.
Yes.
So I'd have a repository for production, a repository for staging, or could I put them in the same repository and just have an environmental repository?
It could be the same, different directories in the repository or different repositories. I personally prefer different repositories, one repository for each environment, because from that perspective, an environment is equivalent to an application, right? When I'm talking about production, I'm looking at production as a whole, as one entity. Just as when I'm working on an application, I'm looking at that application in isolation from the rest, right? As one entity. That application is a collection of many different things, libraries, this and that, right? So to me, at least, it is useful to try to figure out what is the entity that I'm managing. Is that an application? It has its own repository. Is it a library? A library would have its own repository. When I'm working on a specific library that is used by many applications, I'm probably going to have a repository dedicated to that library. So it can go both lower than an application and higher. But yes, production is an entity, and I want to have all the information specific to production. Same thing goes for staging or any other type of environment. And then let's say we can from there we can go up higher or lower, right? I can say, hey, I need to manage a fleet of clusters, right? Then I would have a repository for the fleet of clusters that again would be extending those environments. Let's say that I have a repo for production in cluster A, production in cluster B, and then I can go higher from there and say, hey, I have a repository for fleet of productions. Maybe I have 57 productions in 57 different clusters. And the same logic would apply, right? I would not repeat myself. I would not copy and paste literally all the manifests from all those productions. I would be extending those manifests, which in turn extend the manifests of specific applications and focus on what is specific to that fleet.
I can hear the arguments already beginning to form. I don't want to have 75 different repositories to define this application. Let's play out your example here of I've got the application
only one
repository
to define an application.
Okay. But I'm talking about the runtime. Because what you just said is I've got a fleet of clusters. Mm-hmm. And let's say I've got a fleet of clusters. I've got 5 clusters around the world for each of my 5 environments. So doing basic math, that's going to be 25 repositories plus the application repositories 26, and then 5 extra repositories to define the fleets. So we're at 31 repositories for my application.
You can replace the word repository with directory in a repository.
You could. But if you went to a directory model and you're applying GitOps, then when the hooks come in, are the things going to be okay? I don't know.
Now, here it comes. I think of course, there can be many answers to that question, but as a general rule, I would pick a directory or a repository depending on the direction of the flow of data from that repo. If you're talking about GitOps model, where the direction it is pull-based model, there is a process running somewhere, pulling information from a specific repository and specific directory. And from the pull perspective model, it doesn't really matter whether you have, let's say that you have 3 sources, whether that's 3 directories in a repo or 3 repos directory in each, the same. And having different directories, if that helps you organize better, great. Having 3 repositories, that helps you organize better, again, great. It will usually depend on how you're organized from team perspective, right? It's important more from the human organizational perspective than anything else. And I'm fine with both options. I have no strong preference. Now, if you're talking about push model, then I have the default preference from different repositories because it's somehow easier to deal with, hey, this webhook from that repository goes here and it does this. And this from this repository goes there and does that. Now, that is not to say that that must be the model. We can almost to begin with, almost webhooks most of the time end up in pipelines. They can go to other places, but most of the time it's pipelines, one way or another, right? And we can have logic in pipelines to filter and say, okay, so I received the webhook, but actually the commit is from this directory, therefore I should do this. I'm not sure whether the overhead of doing that is smaller than the overhead of having more repositories. Very often, I think that it's smaller management overhead in having more repositories than doing all the filtering at the destination of webhooks.
I tend to lean towards more repositories versus what I will call the mini mono repo scenario. Not because, only having 5 folders in there is bad, but if from a security and compliance perspective, only certain people should have access to the production-related repositories, I can't do that on a folder basis. I mean, you could, but again, you're doing a lot of extra work that isn't really necessary versus just spinning up a new repository. Yes, there's more repositories. Yes, it's more granular. But all the other things, from a standards perspective, standard meaning, if it's sort of like following Spring Framework. If you do things in a very specific way, magic happens.
Exactly. And that's why I'm not generally in favor of monorepos for applications. Remember that I said for applications, right? Because applications need to be built, they need to be tested, and so on and so forth. Therefore, they have to trigger webhooks. I mean, they don't have to. Pipeline tools can monitor repository, but that, as far as that's ineffective in all, if not or most solutions, right?
Can I correct that a little bit?
Yeah.
It's not that it's ineffective. It's just plain bad.
There you go. Exactly.
Right? Because there was a post that our friend Kosuke Kawaguchi wrote years ago called Polling Must Die.
Exactly.
And if you're still polling things as your only way of getting data, and if that's your only choice, then okay, you got to keep doing it because you don't have hooks that can be sent to you, events, if you will, that can be sent to you. But if you do have events and you're still polling, you should rethink that strategy.
And the key there, I think, is, I think that actually polling is useful as well, but it really depends on the use case. When you need to react on every commit, like pipelines are basically reactions to commit, because every time I push something to Git repo, I want to build something, I want to test something, and so on and so forth, right? Push model simply makes more sense. Now, when my goal is to always have to treat repositories state machines and to have 2 states, Git and the actual state, in sync, then polling happens to me to make more sense, because kind of like you have a processes whose job is not to react to me pushing something to Git repo and build an image, run tests, whatever, but to keep them always in sync, then pooling makes more sense. Especially since pooling also in those situations, the scope of what you're pooling is infinitely smaller. You're suddenly not going through thousands of lines of code and stuff like that. So pipelines pushing GitOps, let's say, the synchronization of the states, pooling model. And that, in my head, influences how we should organize repositories. Application repos, I prefer having a different repo for each application, because applications inherently are in need of the pushing model and with clear destinations. And then if you're talking about repo that defines production, that's the opposite. That's pooling model. And I don't mind having monorepo there. Monorepo as in one directory for staging and another directory for production. And on top of that, I'm avoiding the other problems with monorepos, because there is a problem of having to deal with too much information, too big of a code base, all the applications put together. There's just too much to deal with. But if you're talking about environments, we're talking about YAML files, and not even full definitions, but only the things specific to those environments. So it's such a limited quantity. Usually kind of like if you take all the environment-specific manifests and put them together from all the environments, you're likely going to get still smaller code base, all those combined in a single application, right? So that's the case where some semblance of monorepo to me is okay.
I agree that it's okay, but if I'm shifting everything left and I'm in either a regulated or highly regulated industry, and that means that everyone, including my intern, now can affect what is running in production, by committing to that repository, that's it's okay for them to do it for dev and stage and QA, but it's not okay for production. That monorepo dies fast.
Exactly. When I said okay, I was kind of like based on the preview.
Technically, it's fine. Yeah.
What we mentioned so far. But once we enter into access control, polyrepo wins any time of the day. When we enter into pull requests and reviews, again, polyrepo wins. Because, hey, maybe I care about production, pull requests related to production, and I couldn't care less about pull requests for staging. Maybe I'm not even going to have pull requests for staging. I'm just going to push directly to the mainline. Kind of, why would you for staging have pull requests, right? I mean, sometimes maybe you would. But anyways, and those are already, we're talking about having different processes with different personas and different interests. And having those differences in a single repo is very hard. Very hard. You would need to have really very homogeneous teams and members with almost the same interests across everything, which is hardly the case ever.
Right. And what I would never do is have two separate repositories, one that's for production. So I'm trying to be smart, right? I've got 4 environments. I don't want to have 4 repositories. I only want to have 2. I want to have one for production and one for everything else. Well, now you're operating in 2 different models that you might be able to do, but why would you want to?
Then you're introducing confusion, because once I find out that the production repo is env-production, prod, and naturally I would say, oh, staging, I know where staging is, env-staging. And then, no, staging is actually following a different logic. Staging is in env-everything but production, and the directory staging. We are kind of like all of a sudden having different logic and different processes, and that's okay. I think that having different logic and different processes is okay when there is a clear reason for that.
Yeah, but if the clear reason is I don't want to create another repository, that's not a good reason.
Yes. And at the end of the day, in my head at least, there are downsides of stuffing everything in one repository, but I'm not sure what are the upsides, to be honest, because is it really that different to have 5 repositories from having 5 different directories in a repository? Is it really that different?
I don't think it's that different. I think where people could get messed up is when they use 5 different branches within a repository to represent each of the environments.
Oh, that I'm very, very zealously against. Because I have the logic that mainline branch is the only one that matters. Everything else is temporary. And if you say, okay, not in my case, my branch is permanent, it's called staging, I have another one. And that's that the purpose of branches is for them to be eventually merged to the mainline. That's why we create branches. Staging is not going to ever be mergeable to production, precisely because of the differences that we mentioned before. This application in staging domain has staging.something, and that same application in production has something without the prefix staging or whatever the domain is. So those two, staging is never going to be mergeable to the mainline. And if branches are not mergeable to the mainline, my head starts hurting, and I start getting complications in understanding how all that works.
And although I have done it, I consider it a misuse of what specifically Git is for. So,
if your options are directories in a single repo or branches, directories any time of the day.
But if the better option is going to be just go ahead, if you have access control issues,
exactly,
then if you're fine with an intern being able to bring down production by making an incorrect commit, then okay, you're great. Then single repository with directories.
Not only that, but if you're having different processes. Let's say that I do not care environment that is called I do not care about you. It's okay for that environment to push something directly to the mainline, commits directly to that environment, and for production you want to insist on pull requests, you're going to have complications. I'm not going to say enforcing, but defining the logic behind that. That's a lot of if-else statements in your head, on a paper, or in code, or whatever, for no obvious reason, because it's so much easier to say, hey, in this repo, you create pull requests. In this repo, I do not care.
Yeah. You can create it or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It'd be
whatever,
your choice.
But here, you cannot push to the main line.
Yeah. Nobody can push to mainline.
Yeah, nobody can push.
Everybody has been locked out.
And you don't have to be locked out physically. Under certain circumstances, it's okay to say, hey guys, just don't push to the main line, right? But it's confusing. Okay, so wait, under which circumstances I'm not pushing to the main line? If you want to push to this directory, then you go directly to the main line. And if you want to push to this directory, then you should create a pull request. And if you want to push something that has changes to both of those, then we have a meltdown and we all open a window and jump out of frustration. I'm like, hey, no good reason for that.
Whereas, if you were to just set up a separate repository for each of your environments, you could have cranked down the access control however you want on each one, and life would have gone on. The trade-off is you have more Git repositories.
No, those and many other problems. There is usually an argument, but Google is doing it.
It's a stupid argument. I said it. I said the S word. It's a stupid argument.
It's a good argument if you have the capacity that Google has to solve the problems by writing your own code that solves that problem. So if you're a company that whenever something is not working exactly as you need it to work, you say, oh, okay, so this GitOps tool that I'm using or pipelines or whatever, to trash, I'm going to write my own because it's going to be better. It's going to fit exactly my use cases. When you get to that level, then do whatever you want.
But I would say 99.3% of companies will ever be able to do that.
Yeah, so 99% without 0.3 cannot create a simple pull request to the open source project that they depend on and is currently crashing in their environment, is not working correctly, right? Cannot fix something upstream, which is easier than creating that whole upstream yourself. So if you have difficulty to actually fix your own problems in a project that you're using, then how much problem you would have to create that same project to fit exactly your needs from scratch. Kind of like, write Borg, write Kubernetes yourself, and let me know how it went, right?
And the problem that you're trying to solve is the problem you're having at this moment.
Exactly.
Not the problem that you're going to be having in 2 years from now.
No, solving your own problems. Google has capacity to... First of all, Google has problems that we don't. 3% of us do not have. And then with those problems, it has capacity to solve them.
And by the way, Google Cloud Run did not show up overnight.
Oh, no.
GKE did not show up overnight. If you think that you're going to be able to reproduce what Google does just because you read a blog post about it, you're greatly fooling yourself. So back to the question, from your experience, what do I need to put in place to practice shift-left infrastructural management in production? I think if I was doing it from scratch today, I have my application repo that has the infrastructure as well with it, with the application, a base definition. Then I've got however many repositories that map to environments. And then if I'm actually working in a fleet concept, I'm working regionally, then I would have, how would I do that? Would I have a repository for the fleet in that region, or would it be, so basically I'm going from application down to environment, down to fleet, which would be actually the region area that it's in.
Yeah, then you would have a repo for that.
Repo, so I actually, like, my earlier example was actually backwards.
You have a repo for each unit
cluster,
of something.
Whatever it is.
Right. It can be
wherever it is.
57
location.
layers or exactly. I mean, unit of management, right? Like shared library is not a location, but it is a unit that you manage somehow independently of the applications that use that shared library. the missing piece in that story is which we didn't talk much. So I'll try to be very brief. Is that the way how you manage all that from the left side? You need to pick the tools that allow you to create those services. Like, please do not ask developers to create 573 lines of YAML to deploy their application. You need to create some kind of abstraction that they can define what matters for their applications. And same thing for infrastructure.
Okay. So what do you think? How are you shifting left your infrastructure management? Head over to the Slack workspace and leave a comment over in the podcast channel.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.